Thank you very much. Okay, the committee is considering the Customs Amendment Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership Implementation Bill 2018 and a related bill. The question is that Amendment 1 on sheet 8520, moved by Senator Hanson-Young. Are you seeking the call? Oh, okay. Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've just got some questions to the government, actually, if the minister is able to answer some questions. I wanted to know what the impact will be. Of course, this TPP agreement includes 22 clauses that are effectively on ice, that were insisted on, of course, by the United States in the first round of negotiations. This includes intellectual property chapter, which contains a series of rules which lock in strong monopolies for patents on medicines at the expense of affordable access to medicines. So this is particularly in relation to cancer, medication and treatments. And in addition to longer monopolies on data protection for biologic medicines. So making it much harder and a much longer wait for affordable cancer medicines to be available. These clauses are effectively on ice. They haven't been deleted. Could the minister please explain how these clauses may be reinstated should the United States agree to be a party to this agreement at any point from today onwards?
Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Hanson-Young, for that question. And the answer is that, yes, they can be reinstated if all parties agree.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Why is it that the government, the Australian government and negotiators allowed them to stay in the agreements as simply on ice clauses as opposed to having them deleted? Surely the Australian people would like to know that if there is cancer medication and health advances available when dealing with the very traumatic issues of the various different cancers across the country that patients are suffering today, surely they would have. Surely they would like to know that their government tried to get these clauses deleted. Cancer medication should be as affordable as possible, and I don't think that big pharmaceutical companies should be able to exploit timelines on patents to make them more expensive at the expense of patients being able to have access to that medication at an affordable rate. Could the government and the minister please explain whether they argued for those clauses to be deleted in the first place?
Minister.
Thank you very much. The advice I have is that these were discussed amongst the 11 who signed, and the agreement was not to proceed with them at this stage. However, as I said, if there is agreement amongst all parties, they can be reinstated or adopted.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Did Australia at any point argue that they should be deleted?
Minister.
I don't believe so. Okay. The advice I have is that that's part of confidential negotiations between all 11 parties, but after that negotiation the decision was to retain them but not proceed with them without the United States.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Could the minister please put on the record for the chamber today what the government's position is? Do they believe that these clauses should remain in there, or should they be deleted?
Minister.
Look, the advice I have, Senator Hanson-Young, is that the Australian government did support them, but again it was agreement of all 11 parties not to proceed with them at this stage.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you. I'm trying to ascertain what the government's current position is. Would you support these clauses becoming live again, or is the position that they should be deleted?
Minister.
Okay. Senator Hanson-Young, as I've said now 3 times, I believe, is that the Australian government supported the decision of the other 10 parties to delete them at this time. But again, there is the option to, if the United States joins, to have the discussion again with the other 10 parties to reinstate them.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you. Can I just seek clarification? Do they become live as soon as the US signs up to the TPP, or does each clause need to be renegotiated?
Minister.
Thank you, Senator Hanson-Young. As I've said, if the United States does rejoin, all 11 existing parties would have to discuss and all agree to proceed.
Senator Patrick.
In that instance, Minister, would there be a requirement to bring any change in terms and conditions back to either the JSCOT or indeed the Parliament?
Minister.
Senator Patrick, I can confirm that the normal process and practice would occur in that case, and yes, it would come back to Parliament and JSCOT.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Could the minister please put on the record which types of cancer medication may become more expensive if indeed these clauses become live?
Minister.
Senator Hanson-Young, that is a hypothetical question which goes to a degree of detail that we don't have available because it is a political hypothetical.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Chair. Well, no, it's not. It was a clause that was in there up until 12 months ago. So surely the Australian government has information as to what types of medication will not be available at an affordable rate to Australians if indeed these clauses were to become unfrozen at the initiation of the United States.
Minister.
Senator Hanson-Young, my advice is that there would be no change because anything negotiated under the TPP 11 would be consistent with our existing Australian laws in relation to the PBS.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Could the minister please outline what these clauses would mean if indeed they came back into effect?
Minister.
Senator Hanson-Young, as I said in answer to your previous question, again you're asking hypothetical. You can make any sort of political points and debate you want, but I'm just saying to you that they are hypothetical. And again, if they are activated at some point, it would come back to the Parliament, come back to JSCOT, and there would be no implications because they would be still consistent with the PBS guidelines and rules.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Let's move on and see if we can get some answers to some other issues. Did the Australian government ever insist that ISDS clauses were not to be included in the TPP negotiations?
Minister.
Senator Hanson-Young, of course not.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Could the minister please explain why that is the case, why Australia has not sought to have ISDS provisions either deleted or why the government hasn't opted for side deals to prevent ISDS provisions being used against Australia from other countries, as has been done by New Zealand, why Australia hasn't participated or gone down that route. It seems absolutely crazy why the Australian government is signing us up to something that allows our government and our taxpayers to be sued by multinational companies. Was there any discussion at any point for side deals with any countries to get Australia out of this ridiculous situation where corporations will be able to sue Australian governments?
Minister.
Senator Hanson-Young, as you're aware, if you'd listened to the debate yesterday and to both the minister's speech and mine yesterday, is that the Australian government very strongly supports the ISDS considerations in here, and no matter how much and we heard the rhetoric from, I think, from 4 Green senators yesterday ad nauseum about neoliberalism and all of these other great green conspiracy buzzwords coming out in relation to the ISDS. But as we both said yesterday, these are not new provisions, and all of this conspiracy about the lack of sovereignty and that, large corporations, I think you described them yesterday, these great neoliberal, whatever that means, conspiracy would mean that we'd lose sovereignty is simply nonsense. These are provisions that have been in place in other treaties for a considerable amount of time, and there is no company that has been successful. And as we heard yesterday, there was one company and they were unsuccessful because the courts had no jurisdiction over that matter. So yes, they are reciprocal requirements, and if we're expecting to get that benefit out of the treaty ourselves, it is only logical that others expect us to provide the same clauses. So there is no loss of sovereignty and there is no breach, and in fact, if we did do that, we would now be in breach of the treaty itself, which I think that Penny Wong yesterday, Senator Kitching, and also Senator Farrell last night, all of them gave very cogent arguments as to why this treaty must be signed, and if it's not, and if we did do anything with the ISDS or the labour labour market testing, then we would be in breach of this. And again, they gave very cogent reasons last night why this has to be moved without these amendments.
Senator Patrick.
Minister, just would like to put on the record that whilst there has been one ISDS litigation against Australia, the Philip Morris case, and that's well known, of course there is another matter on foot right now, and inconsistent with the views of DFAT, where they've said that that in actual fact there's only limited circumstances where ISDS can be invoked. There is a matter on foot at this present moment where the government disputes the ability to litigate. I just wonder if that particular matter had any impact in the consideration that the government had when discussing ISDS.
Minister.
Thank you. Look, I don't have advice on that second case, and I'd imagine if it is before the courts, if the officials here are not aware of it and the minister's not aware of it, I can't comment on that matter further. And clearly, even if we were aware of it, it would be a matter before the courts and we couldn't comment on it.
Senator Patrick.
Indeed, it's not a matter before the courts because as you well understand, the ISDS is not litigated in a court. So it's not a matter of sub judice. It can be commented on. Indeed, I've asked the government, just to be very clear, how much that litigation is costing. I went through a fairly detailed process, former Senator Xenophon and myself, in relation to the Philip Morris case. The government resisted, eventually gave us the number on that. $39 million was spent on litigation. I have asked the attorney to provide data on that. So the matter is live. It is not before a court, and indeed the government's very well aware of it.
Minister.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just at this point re-emphasise, and it's a point that Senator Reynolds has made, and it was a point made in the debate yesterday. The purpose of ISDS provisions is to provide, indeed, certainty for investors. Those are provisions that, yes, they do flow in both directions. However, it should always be emphasised that when the Philip Morris case is raised, it should be made clear and that ultimately that case was not successful. That case did not proceed, and that Australia's arguments in terms of ensuring that case did not proceed were successful. However, Australian investors overseas, in countries that sometimes have less well-established judicial and legal frameworks than Australia has, less predictable policy settings, possibly less regard for retrospective legislation or actions not being pursued, that these provisions provide protections for Australian entities operating in other jurisdictions. Senator Patrick asks about another matter. In relation to that other matter, I'm happy to talk in a less public forum with Senator Patrick about some of the arguments that Australia may make in that regard. But we continue to believe that, on balance, and these matters are always a matter of balance, but that on balance, the benefits to Australians operating in other markets far outweigh the risks compared to Australia in terms of the maintenance of these provisions, particularly when you then consider the carve-outs and exclusions that are clearly made in them that enable the Australian government to continue to make policies in relation to healthcare, the environment, education standards or the like that are clearly within the Australian national interest.
Senator Hanson.
Thank you. Minister, can you give me or this chamber or the people of Australia an example of how the ISDS can be implemented or called upon by a multinational company on the Australian people?
Minister.
Chair, the point that I just made is that the provisions have never been used successfully against Australia, that these provisions have existed in our investment agreements and otherwise for more than 30 years. They're not some new concept dreamed up just the other day or exclusive only to this matter. They have been around for more than 30 years, and there's only one case that's occurred to a point of finality, and that case ultimately did not proceed and was thrown out, and the Australian government's position was upheld. So no, I can't give you a case where they've been used successfully by a multinational company or any other against Australia, because none exists in 30 years of history. There are, however, instances where Australian investors have, in limited cases, used these provisions. I'd also just make the point, and it's one that happens from the extremes at both ends of the chamber, the pejorative use of the term multinational companies. These provisions could well be used by Australian family companies who also happen to invest in other markets and ought to have their investments protected too.
Senator Hanson.
Minister, you misunderstood my question. I wasn't asking where it was used. I was asking what would trigger it to be used in Australia. What could the multinational company do to impose an ISDS on the Australian people?
Minister.
That, in the rephrasing of the question, Senator Hanson, you've clearly gone to then a hypothetical scenario of what could a company seek. Companies can seek to do things all the time. Philip Morris sought to use the provisions against Australia. They were unsuccessful. Senator
Patrick.
So I just wanted to go back to the matter that has been raised. I just want to clarify to the chamber. The matter that I was referring to is actually a matter being raised under the US-Australia Fair Trade Agreement, and they are exercising a right to not be treated any differently to another nation that may well be have an ISDS right. So that's the sort of controversy. I just want to clear that up. But I do want to ask the question. No doubt, as you diligently went through the negotiations, and I understand you say the position of the government was to support ISDS, when you got to those provisions, you would have presumably worked through those provisions. At that point in time, was the negotiating team aware of what New Zealand was doing in respect of the side letters that they were having written up?
Thank you, Senator Patrick. Minister.
Senator Patrick, in relation to what New Zealand did, my understanding is that was done at the end of the negotiations and wasn't actually part of the discussions and negotiations that Australia took part in. It was a separate side arrangement that New Zealand did.
Senator Patrick.
Also, as part of those deliberations, and I understand the timing may have been an issue here, it's quite apparent now that the European Union are walking away from ISDS, not allowing them to be included in free trade agreements, and indeed under NAFTA, President Trump has managed to remove that as well. I'm wondering, in the consideration of government, Firstly, did that occur after the government had already negotiated the ISDS position for the TPP, or alternatively, what effect or what consideration has the government given to other First World nations that are now pulling away from ISDS? Have they conducted an analysis of why they're doing that and considered those particular instances?
Minister.
Thanks, Chair. Senator Patrick, the government and I, as relatively new Trade Minister, will always consider the best possible approach that we can take in each and every trade negotiation. It is for others, such as the EU, to make and determine their own positions. However, I do emphasise the point before that provisions that provide a degree of investment certainty to Australian businesses operating in other jurisdictions, we think are important, that they do provide that opportunity for Australian businesses to look abroad, invest abroad, create opportunities that then may see profits and opportunities repatriated back to Australia to some extent, and encouraging that activity by Australian businesses is good for us. It's also good for the nation in which they're investing in and creating jobs and opportunities and paying taxes in that nation. And we ought to be realistic enough to recognise that Australia is a standout nation in global terms when you look at matters such as the rule of law, judicial process and, frankly, governments of both political persuasions acting in generally responsible ways that don't go and see retrospective actions that could be detrimental to investment decisions that have been taken. Not every other nation has such a strong track record. That's why we think, on balance, such provisions are useful and important for Australian companies in their operations overseas.
Senator Patrick.
Thank you, Minister, for articulating the thought process that you went through. Obviously, if I went to the Europeans or to the US, they probably would think about matters in much the same way as you have, but they've managed to come to a different conclusion. And the burden of my question is, have you looked at their reasoning? Have we discussed with the Europeans, indeed the US, why they have now taken a different course on ISDS? Because we may well benefit from some of their experience. I'm just wondering whether we've had conversations, whether we've looked to why it is that they have done what they've done, and then tried to consider whether or not that was relevant for Australia, and maybe you did, and maybe you came to a different conclusion. I'm just trying to make sure, just going to the due diligence that you've been through in coming to the conclusion that you have.
Minister.
Senator, as I indicated before, the thought process and the benefits that we see on balance to Australian companies. And as I also indicated, in relation to future trade negotiations and deliberations, we will always seek to apply the best practice provisions that we can see as being available to Australia in our operations as a nation at any time. In relation to the EU, I think it's important not to completely mischaracterise the EU's stance. I'm advised that the EU has stated that investment agreements, where deemed necessary, should in principle be negotiated in parallel to FTAs. And then on the 20th of March this year, the European Council adopted and published the negotiating directives for a convention establishing a multilateral court for the settlement of investment disputes. So the EU is clearly looking indeed at processes that do still provide for impartial settlement of investment disputes, and indeed that also both the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement and the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement include ISDS and foresee setting up a permanent multilateral mechanism and contain such reference to it. So to simply take the argument and suggest the EU have said no ISDS or equivalent would be a misrepresentation of the position. Of course, as I said, each area of a trade agreement, when we enter into new deliberations, ought to be thought of in a wise and sensible way about how we get the best possible outcomes in the interests of Australia, across goods, across services, across investment, across the whole range of different factors that a comprehensive trade agreement encompasses. And when it comes to investment, providing certainty and stability around investment is important. I've outlined the reasons as to why we think, on balance, there's far greater upside for Australian businesses investing overseas than there are risks, and indeed there are a number of cases and instances where Australian companies have taken advantage of those provisions and been successful, unlike the fact that nobody has ever been successful in using them against Australia.
Senator Patrick.
So thank you, Minister. In effect, you're indicating that you have done some work. You've looked at what the Europeans have done, and I thank you for clarifying that situation. And maybe this can be taken on notice if you don't know the answer, or perhaps come back to the chamber. Having looked at the differences, I mean, there's clearly a reason why they've taken a different pathway. And the sensible thing in this circumstance, I imagine, and I know you try to do your work as diligently as possible, would be to examine perhaps the jurisdictional issues, the bounds in which the claims may get made, all of those sorts of things that the Europeans are doing slightly differently, no doubt from lessons learned. They have had a number of ISDS cases brought against them, so they have perhaps more experience. Whether or not you could give some advice as to what their motives were, what they're trying to do with this new arrangement, and indeed why we don't think those new arrangements would be applicable for Australia.
Minister. I think those matters will probably best be dealt with the opportunities presented to Senator Patrick to ask questions that can be referred to some of the trade negotiators and trade officials at estimates next week.
Senator Hanson.
Yeah, thank you. You say the ISDS has not been used in Australia. Apart from the tobacco company, they did, but they weren't successful. If there was a challenge under the ISDS and it was successful, who is responsible to pay the fine or the monies?
Thank you, Senator Hanson. Minister.
Senator Hanson, that's a purely hypothetical question, and I don't believe we're in a position to answer a hypothetical question on a case that doesn't exist.
Senator Hanson.
Sorry, that is not an answer, that it's hypothetical. You have put this in the agreement, the ISDS. You must know that if a multinational company was to sue, are they suing the government? If they are suing the government, they must sue someone. Someone has to be responsible for paying that. So it's not a hypothetical question whatsoever, and the people of Australia demand an answer and should have that answer to that. Are the taxpayers responsible for the fine?
Minister.
Sure. Senator Hanson, if the government of Australia goes and seizes land off of individuals and they seek compensation for that, the government of Australia is indeed responsible for that, or for other assets, or for other things that might be in that way taken upon as a claim against Australia. Could well be taken upon in most instances as a claim under normal domestic law and processes were the government of Australia to act in such a way. Governments of Australia of both political persuasions don't tend to act in those ways. That's why, of course, these provisions have not been used successfully against Australia. They have been used successfully by Australian businesses operating elsewhere. And I would have thought, Senator Hanson, that you would have believed that Australia's systems of government were capable and responsible and did not pose a threat to investors, but that perhaps Australian businesses operating in other markets deserved appropriate protections.
Senator Hanson.
Minister, in that, if you believe that we have a very good government and system in Australia, then why put it in? Why put the ISDS in the first place anyway? But the whole fact is you have not answered the question, who is responsible for paying it? If you have a multinational company that comes out here and they are actually then suing the government, whether because of change of legislation which has caused them to lose loss of profits from their businesses or for whatever reason, is the taxpayer responsible for that payment?
Minister.
Senator Hanson, I'll try to spell it out even more simply than I gave in the previous answer. If Australian governments undertake actions that would, in most cases, be a breach of our constitutional principles or our laws of the land, that in some way damaged, in a retrospective sense, the investments of investors, then governments are held to account for that. Overwhelmingly, that happens through our domestic legal processes. You go and seize the assets of a company unfairly, they'll sue you in the court of law, because Australia's court system and legal frameworks recognise and respect that already. But the ISDS would provide an additional fallback potentially for investors in Australia. The reason they've never been used successfully is twofold. One, Australian governments don't tend to behave in that way. Two, if they did, our domestic legal procedures already provide for probably better, easier, more secure avenues for investors to take action against governments that behave in such ways against basic principles. The point, Senator Hanson, you asked the question, why would we include such provisions? To protect Australian companies operating in other markets, to protect Australian businesses who think, you know what, I can do better than just doing business in Australia. I can also grow my business by operating in other countries, in other investment scenarios. And we ought to back those businesses. We can be a tiny, shallow, little inward-looking country, if you like, and not actually encourage our businesses to look outwards, or we can be a nation where we encourage Australian businesses to seize investment opportunities, to go and work in other nations, and these provisions provide some protection over and above the domestic legal frameworks of those countries. We support them because, on balance, they are proven over time to give greater protection to Australian businesses operating in more uncertain legal environments than they do to foreign investors operating in Australia's well-established and quite certain and secure legal environment.
Senator Carr.
I'd like to outline the opposition's position in regard to amendments. There are a series of amendments, and I won't waste the committee's time by speaking on each and every amendment. The opposition position on these questions I explained yesterday in general terms. This is a trade bill that goes to, it's effectively a customs bill. It's not subject to amendment in terms of whether or not we like the agreement. It's not a question of ratification. It is a measure, a series of a bill that seeks to implement the tariff reductions that come into force as a result of this agreement. We should be clear about what we're actually doing here. Now, I don't think it changes one thing, how many times you repeat the same question over and again. You've got your answer from the government. The government's position has been explained quite clearly in my mind. I don't agree with what the government has said. The Labor Party doesn't agree with what the government has said, and we will seek to make changes to these measures if there is a change of government at the next election. But when it comes to the specifics of these measures, the Labor Party will not be supporting any of these amendments. We will not be supporting any of these amendments. We will not be supporting any of these amendments because they are essentially irresponsible, reckless and, frankly, against the national interest. They're moved by South Australian senators who I am surprised have not better understanding of their own domestic industrial interests. And I would have thought that an understanding of what actually is going on in the steel industry would be pertinent. And would understand what was actually happening in the meat industry would be pertinent. Would understand what was actually going on in the cotton industry, would understand what was going on in the wine industry in South Australia would be a matter of some significance, in seafood and horticulture, in cereal and what have you. See, what I don't want to see, I don't agree with so many of the provisions that this government has embarked upon. But what I don't want to see is advantages taken as a result of actions by this Senate which advantages New Zealand and Canada against the interest of Australia. And the purpose that we've been asked to endorse here is a proposition which would do exactly that. Provide advantage to our international competitors. And how you can possibly suggest that that would be in the national interest strikes me as somewhat more demented than normal in this place. And that's the circumstance in which we've been asked to consider these provisions today. So the Labor Party won't be supporting these propositions. This is a tariff bill that goes to change the structure of the tariff provisions. If you want to talk about the general principles of the TPP, you had the chance in the second reading yesterday, which you did, but you won't be able to prosecute it through these specific amendments with our support.
Thank you, Senator Carr. Minister.
Thank you, and I thank Senator Carr for his contribution both yesterday and again today. And for many of the reasons that Senator Carr has been so clear on in this place, the government also will not be supporting any of the amendments before the Senate on these bills. So I do thank all senators for their contributions on this bill, but as Senator Carr has just noted, these are customs amendment bills, and the majority of the debate has been a re-prosecution of issues that go to the heart of the TPP itself and not to these custom amendment bills. So, as I said, I thank all senators for their contributions to this debate, and the government will not be supporting the amendments before the Senate.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Patrick.
To clarify, the case that I was referring to is APR Energy Holding Limited and the Commonwealth of Australia. I will then also now just like to ask the Minister just to confirm for me a circumstance, and I apologise, I use a hypothetical just to give context to the question, but a circumstance where Australia changes a policy in this place that gives rise to an application under ISDS, and you know, the government may say that that's not likely, but actually it's not a matter for the government to decide that. An applicant can simply make the application and you can contest jurisdiction or the appropriateness of that. So let's have a situation where a policy has changed, an international company makes an application, and they choose to do so because they can, to use ISDS as the mechanism for doing so. I just want to confirm that in the same circumstances, an Australian company who is affected by the policy change, can you just confirm that they don't have the ability to make application under ISDS for the same potential damage to the Australian company?
Chair, Senator Patrick, Australian companies operating domestically within Australia, of course, have all of the protections of Australian law, starting underpinned by the constitutional protections that provide for a range of protections and scenarios. I don't believe that there are any scenarios in which you could suggest that an investor into Australia received greater or more preferential access to be able to have a dispute settled than an Australian company with all of the prerogatives of Australian domestic law available to them.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Patrick.
So the burden of my question really relates to in circumstances where the company chooses not to use the courts, because of course the multinationals can use our court system. We don't constrain them in any way from doing that. So the question is the difference between an Australian company raising an application, an ISDS application, and an international company raising an ISD application, because that's the mechanism they wish to go down. Just confirm, can an Australian company raise an ISDS application against the Australian government?
Minister.
Well, Chair, I don't believe that that would be the case. I stand to be corrected and will double-check for the senator. As I indicated in my answer to Senator Hanson previously, I think if you look at the reasons why ISDS is not being used against the Australian government, there are two primary reasons that exist. One relates to the behaviour of Australian governments of both persuasions, which don't give cause to the types of behaviours that would necessitate the use of an ISDS provision or indeed any other claims against Australian governments. The second reason then relates to the strength of the rule of law that is operable in Australia and the opportunities that that investors in Australia, be they domestic or foreign investors, have to be able to pursue any claims they may have against Australian governments in relation to the decisions of those governments. So I think the compounding factors there are such that, as I say, there's no scenario I can conceive of where an ISDS provision would provide a preferential access to people to dispute matters in Australia that you couldn't do through normal domestic provisions and arrangements.
Thank you, Minister. It being 2 p.m, the committee reports progress.